right now, sitting in a glass jar in your kitchen pantry, there are hundreds of dormant living organisms.
Yeah, organisms you're probably planning to eat for dinner at some point this week.
Exactly. I mean, we just call them spices, right? We sprinkle them on roasted veggies or, use them to flavor a soup.
Right. But biologically speaking, those little flakes and pods are actually suspended embryos.
Which is wild to think about. They're living things just holding their breath, waiting for the right environmental trigger to wake up.
It really is a complete paradigm shift.
Yeah.
Like when you stop looking at your pantry as just the final stop on this industrial supply chain,
Yeah.
and you start looking at it as a collection of biological potential. Because we treat spices as these static, inanimate objects, right?
A little bit.
But beneath that dry exterior, there's an entire genetic instruction manual just waiting to be executed.
And that biological potential is exactly what we're exploring in today's deep dive.
We've got a really fascinating source for this one.
We do. We're pulling from a single, highly documented blog entry. It's dated May 22nd, 2026.
By an author who goes by the name Ang.
Right, Ang. And the post is titled The Cumin Chronicles, A Second Attempt at Propagation. But the subtitle is what really sets the tone here.
Oh yeah. Notes on Gardening, Part 902.
Part 902. I mean, that number alone gives you such a perfect profile of this author,
It implies this massive, sustained practice. Like Ang isn't just casually throwing some grocery store seeds in the dirt on a sunny afternoon to see what happens.
Yo, definitely not.
This is someone who documents, observes, and really iterates.
So our mission today is to follow Ang's methodology, right? We're going to use this to understand the mechanics of seed viability, the cellular biology of dormancy.
And maybe my favorite part, how you can deduce the microscopic state of a seed just by looking at a grocery store receipt.
Yes. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the brilliance of Ang's current experiment, we really have to look at the previous failure.
Right, the title literally says, this is a second attempt.
Exactly. So originally, Ang tried to cultivate cumin, which goes by the scientific name Cuminum cyminum.
Using seeds that were mixed together in just a generic spice blend.
Yeah, you take a pinch of mixed spices, bury them in some soil, water them, and just wait.
And the result of that first attempt was, well, a complete biological failure.
Nothing sprouted at all.
Zero. And from a botanical perspective, that failure is entirely predictable.
How so?
Well, think of a dormant seed as like a compressed zip file on a computer.
Okay.
All the genetic instructions required to build a root system, a stem, leaves, they're packed tightly inside, perfectly preserved.
Right.
But to unzip that file, you need the correct password. And in the botanical world, that password is a highly specific combination of moisture, temperature, and light.
Ah, I see. And a mixed spice jar is essentially a bowl full of different file formats, right?
Yeah.
All requiring completely different passwords.
Precisely. A mustard seed might need a totally different soil depth than a coriander seed.
Right. Or a cumin seed might need a different temperature gradient than fennel.
Exactly. So if you throw them all into the same pot, you're creating biological chaos.
It's like buying a handful of random, unlabeled lottery tickets.
That's a great way to put it. You have no idea what conditions you're actually providing, or which specific seed is failing to unzip.
And Ang recognizes this flaw immediately.
Because when you have a failure in an experiment with too many overlapping variables, you just can't deduce the mechanism of the failure.
Was the soil too acidic? Was the watering schedule wrong? Or was it just that chaotic combo of different seeds competing for resources?
Right. So by purchasing a fresh pack of pure, unmixed cumin seeds, Ang executes the foundational step of the scientific method.
Isolating the variable.
Exactly. Isolating the variable. Treating the garden not just as a hobby, but as a laboratory.
And the shift in focus in Ang's writing is palpable. Like, once the variable is isolated, Ang provides these striking physical details about the pure cumin.
Yeah, the sensory details are great.
They really are. Ang describes them as resembling tiny grains of rough rice. They have this elongated, ridged shape and a pale brownish color.
And the smell. The moment that package is opened, there's that intense, earthy, nutty aroma that just instantly makes your mouth water.
It really improves most dishes. But Ang isn't just treating this as a lab ingredient. There's this real appreciation for the physical and sensory reality of the plant.
Which is crucial because it anchors the experiment. Ang now has a specific target.
Right.
The goal has shifted from this chaotic, let's see what happens, to a highly targeted hypothesis.
Can a pure batch of grocery store cumin actually germinate?
Right. But having a pure batch of seeds introduces a completely different, much more invisible hurdle.
Oh, because even if the seeds are pure, and even if you provide the exact right password of moisture and temperature, there's still a massive unseen variable.
A post-harvest history.
Yeah. The journey that seed took from a farm through an industrial processing plant and finally to the grocery store aisle.
Botanists talk about this all the time. When commercial spices are processed for global mass consumption, they are rarely just picked and tossed into a jar.
Right, they're agricultural products,
Yeah.
which means they're susceptible to mold, fungus, insect larvae during transit.
Exactly. So to extend shelf life and meet international safety standards, massive commercial distributors often subject these seeds to aggressive sterilization treatments.
And the two most common methods are high heat treatment and commercial irradiation.
Right.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this is where the biology gets somewhat tragic for a gardener.
It really does.
Think of a seed as a tiny dormant spaceship. It looks perfectly intact on the outside, but if it went through irradiation, the embryo has been removed. It will never launch.
That's incredibly accurate because what's happening during irradiation is cellular destruction on a microscopic level.
Walk us through that. What actually happens to the zip file?
So when a batch of spice is irradiated, it's bombarded with gamma rays. And those gamma rays act like microscopic scissors. Yeah. They penetrate the outer hull of the seed and literally slice up the DNA inside the plant embryo. They break the chemical bonds of the genetic code.
But the seed still looks absolutely perfect on the outside.
Exactly. It retains its brownish color, its elongated shape, and even its earthy aroma because the essential oils are largely unaffected.
But the genetic instruction manual has been completely shredded.
Precisely. The pilot is gone, the embryo is dead, it will never grow, no matter how perfectly you recreate its natural habitat.
And high heat treatment does something similar, right? Just through thermodynamics instead of radiation.
Yeah, extreme heat denatures the proteins inside the embryo. It permanently alters their molecular structure.
It almost like boiling an egg. You permanently change the clear liquid into a solid white.
That's a perfect analogy. And once those proteins are denatured, the biological machinery required for germination just ceases to exist.
So Aang is sitting in a kitchen with a pure jar of cumin seeds, knowing full well that they might be entirely sterile. And without a high-powered electron microscope or a university laboratory, there's no physical way to look at the seeds and know if the DNA has been shredded or if the proteins are denatured.
The visual evidence is identical either way.
So how do you test for viability without a lab?
Well, you have to look outside of biology. You have to look at the supply chain.
Okay.
And what's fascinating here is Aang's truly brilliant analytical leap. Aang doesn't look at the seeds to determine their cellular viability.
No.
Aang looks at the grocery store receipt.
The price tag. It's such a clever proxy.
It really is a stunning intersection of economics and cellular biology. Aang notes the remarkably cheap price of this pure cumin package.
Right, because commercial irradiation facilities and high-tech thermal sterilization plants, they require millions of dollars in infrastructure maintenance energy to operate.
They're incredibly expensive steps in a supply chain. If a manufacturer is paying for that level of processing, they have to pass that overhead cost down to the consumer.
To maintain their profit margins. The logic is airtight.
Yeah. If you are holding a premium, highly expensive jar of organic spices, it might actually have a lower chance of sprouting.
Wow, because the company had the budget to rigorously sterilize it.
Exactly. But because Aang's pure cumin was incredibly cheap, it strongly implies that the distributor skipped those expensive post-harvest treatments.
They just packed the raw agricultural product into a bag and shipped it.
So Aang forms a valid scientific hypothesis based on retail economics. Because the economic value of the product is so low, its biological potential remains high.
The genetic zip file is likely intact. The microscopic scissors never touched it.
That's the bet Aang is making.
Okay, so Aang has bet on the cheap price tag, meaning these seeds are alive, the variable is isolated, the post-harvest history is deduced.
Now comes the actual execution.
Right. Now we actually have to run the physical test. How on earth do you execute this without ruining all the careful prep work?
Aang outlines two possible propagation protocols.
Yeah.
And the contrast between them is really fascinating.
Method 1 is the casual approach, right? You simply take these pure cumin seeds, scatter them into some empty spaces in your outdoor garden pots.
Cover them with a little soil and let nature take its course. It's the way humans have practiced agriculture for millennia.
Wait, I have to stop here because this logic seems totally counterproductive.
How so?
Aang just spent all this time isolating the pure cumin and using economic theory to deduce that the cellular embryos are still alive.
Right.
Why on earth would the first instinct be to just throw them outside? Especially because Aang specifically notes in the blog that the local heat wave season is just starting.
Yes. The heat wave.
Isn't throwing them into scorching outdoor soil just introducing a massive, uncontrollable weather variable into an otherwise perfectly controlled experiment? I mean, it's just setting them up for failure.
This raises an important question about risk management in gardening. You've hit on the exact tension between in vivo and in vitro testing.
Okay, break those down for us.
In vivo refers to testing something in its living, natural, chaotic environment, like the outdoor pots. And you are entirely correct about the risk.
Right, because of the heat.
If Aang scatters the seeds outside during a heat wave, the thermodynamics of the topsoil could easily denature the proteins in the seeds.
Basically replicating the exact industrial heat treatment they just managed to avoid at the factory.
Exactly. And if the seeds don't sprout outdoors during a heat wave, the data is completely useless.
Because you still won't know if the seeds were dead on the grocery store shelf, or if the heat wave just scorched them to death in the dirt. You learn absolutely nothing.
Which is the fundamental problem with introducing unmanageable environmental variables. And Aang realizes this immediately.
Right.
The blog notes that the outdoor scatter method would only work if the pots could be watered with absolute, strict regularity.
Which is a nearly impossible task during a severe heat wave where evaporation rates are unpredictable.
Right. So, recognizing the flaw in the in vivo approach, Aang pivots to an in vitro approach. Method 2, the controlled environment.
The damp kitchen towel method. Or, as Aang also suggests, pre-soaking the seeds in water for 24 hours.
This is a classic botanical viability test. It's not just some quaint trick for home gardeners, It's rooted in the cellular mechanics of how a seed wakes up.
Imbibition, right.
Yes, imbibition. The first stage of germination. The dry seed coat has to rapidly absorb water to swell, break open, and trigger the metabolic enzymes inside the embryo.
So by placing the seeds inside a damp, folded kitchen towel indoors away from the heat wave, Aang is artificially supplying the exact password the zip file needs.
Exactly. You are removing the environment as an enemy.
That is so smart.
In the damp towel, there's no threat of the sun baking the soil. There's no threat of the moisture evaporating too quickly. No threat of pests.
You're isolating the biological viability of the seed from the chaos of nature.
And that 24-hour soak accelerates that imbibition process, breaking down the tough outer hull of the cumin seed so the water can reach the embryo faster.
It's a pure proof of concept test. If you put 10 seeds in a damp paper towel and leave them on your kitchen counter, you can observe them directly every single day.
Yes.
And if even one of them produces a tiny white radical, that first little root pushing out of the hump, it confirms Aang's entire chain of logic. It proves the grocery store batch is biologically viable.
And once you have that baseline confirmation, your risk management completely changes.
Because you know what you're working with.
Exactly. If the paper towel test succeeds, you know the seeds are alive.
Yeah.
You can then take the rest of the batch and confidently plant them in the outdoor soil.
And if they fail to grow outside after that, you've isolated the failure.
You know with absolute certainty that it was an environmental issue, maybe the heat wave or the soil composition, not a cellular problem with the seeds themselves.
Tracing Aang's methodology from start to finish is incredibly satisfying, honestly.
It really is.
We started with absolute chaos.
Yeah.
A handful of random mixed spices failing to grow because of competing biological needs.
Right.
And step by step, we move to a rigorous framework for problem solving. Isolating the cyminum variable. Deducing the invisible post-harvest history of heat treatments and gamma radiation just by analyzing the retail price.
Yeah.
And finally, designing a highly controlled in vitro test to bypass the environmental chaos of a heat wave.
It's a masterclass in treating the home garden as a laboratory. I mean, Aang took a mundane household object, subjected it to observation, formed a hypothesis based on economics, and executed a controlled test to measure cellular life.
It's so cool.
It elevates a simple blog post about a failed spice garden into a universal framework for how to think critically about the objects we interact with every single day.
So what does this all mean for you? Next time you are cooking dinner and you reach for that jar of cumin or mustard seed or coriander, I encourage you to pause for just a second.
Just look at them.
Yeah. Look at those little glass jars on your spice rack differently. They are not just a static inventory of flavorings. Every single unbroken seed in those jars has an agricultural history, a specific economic footprint, and potentially a living genetic embryo just waiting for a damp paper towel to trigger its imbibition.
You are literally surrounded by dormant biology disguised as dinner ingredients.
It's incredible.
It is. And, it does leave you with a much larger, almost philosophical question to consider.
Oh, what's that?
Well, if these incredibly cheap, entirely ordinary grocery store spices are actually living embryos suspended in animation,
Yeah.
what other seemingly inanimate dead objects in our modern homes are actually just dormant? What else is sitting quietly on a shelf, fully intact, just waiting for the right environmental catalyst to suddenly spring to life?